It's a lot of fun to be here at DEF. This is my first conference, and I've met a few of you at smaller DEF events around the country. To be able to get together with everybody and feel all this energy, discover that my new favorite pen is not the one that I usually sign books with, but a Sharpie that I'm keeping in my pocket now because it was so useful in the design exercise we did yesterday. I've learned a lot already, and hopefully this day will continue in that. So my name, again, is August Cole. I'm a writer. I've written some fiction, like Ghost Fleet. I used to be a newspaper reporter. I am the director of the Art of Future Warfare project at the Atlantic Council, which is a partner of DEF. We're very happy about that, and I'm a senior fellow there. And I also am a writer in residence at a company called Avicent, which is a consulting company. You know, all these projects kind of come together at events like this, elements where there is creative thinking, design, industry aspects, the process that we're trying to shake up from status quo. We're often left asking what are the right tools to do that, because doing the same thing again and again with the same tools often gives the same results. So I'll talk a little bit about the Art of Future Warfare project itself, because we're at a really exciting phase with that right now. I think the images that you're going to see on the screen behind me are mostly from the project. Right there, for example, that is essentially it's a Marine from the future drawn by an artist named Alex Jessup. He's a concept artist. It wasn't drawn for us specifically. It was for his day job, which is working for Sledgehammer Games, doing design. He made that for Call of Duty. So the project has been running for about a year, and we set out with this goal to see if artists could have a meaningful role in the national security community. If the way they work, the things they think about, the visions they pull out of thin air are of use. We kind of really did approach it with an open-ended question, trying to figure out if there was a there. You know, we've had leaders like General Dempsey, Admiral Stavridis, who have talked about not only the importance of writing and reading, which you all, I think, know is an extremely elemental part of any career, military or civilian, but also the importance of fiction. Recently, Admiral Stavridis wrote a nice piece, I think it was in Foreign Policy, about the value of reading Russian fiction to understand the future of Putin's ambitions in Europe. I think during the past year, as we set about to make the case that artists have a role, we decided that we would approach this in a few different ways. One would be reaching out to artists themselves, trying to engage them directly. The other would be to open up our aperture to find artists in the military, in the gaming industry, in corners where they may not ordinarily have a chance to share their work with Washington. We've done that with crowdsourced contests, essentially short story contests. We've done it with graphic art contests. This is a winning entry by an artist in England, in Oxford, named Alex Brady. And it is the best entry that was tied to an event we were inspired by, really, the kind of TRADOC and Arctic exploration of the future of urban warfare in megacities. And so we put a call out to have visual artists weigh in on this. Each of these contests is tied to an event. That event was particularly fun because we sold comic books in the lobby of the Atlantic Council, something that think tanks don't often do. It was important, though, because we were trying to use a different way of thinking, a visual way of thinking that artists can bring into a conversation that's often very analytical and very data-driven, to think about something extremely complex and difficult like the future of urban conflict. Now, the arc of our contests began about a year ago with exploring how a next great war might start. And then we explored how it might be conducted actually in space in the late 21st century. And there's something to think about when you start asking questions about space war, because you can devolve pretty quickly into what they call space opera, things that really don't have much bearing on reality. In fact, what we found, though, was that by pushing the chronological boundary out there, we were able to get people out of their comfort zones. You know, one of the artists who's been helpful to us has been Doctrine Man, whose work you see here. And some of his future-oriented cartoons, I think, are actually some of the best, in part because he had built up, I think, has built up a really kind of keen insight into the enduring aspects of war that will be present in the future, very much taking on the same themes that H.R. McMaster has done, but doing so in a very visual and usually really, really funny, always, I should say, an always really funny way. Those contests have become, I think, a centerpiece of the project and will continue to be so in the second year as we embark upon this. We tied an event to Ghost Fleet, the book that I wrote about the next World War, where we called for propaganda from the next World War. So you'll see after this the posters that graphic artists, visual designers produced for us, essentially trying to put yourself in the mindset of somebody in the future who was being able to look at the kinds of images they would see Not even in a digital world, but imagine an environment where your digital access and connectivity is degraded. The importance of the poster may actually become more acute. So that, again, was another way to kind of divert the conversation into a new direction, and a new way to explore something really fundamental and often very hard to talk about, like the outbreak and the conduct of a great power war. When we think about our goals for this project, I think you have to be very realistic about what you can expect, because you are doing something different. You're doing things that are disruptive, and we often forget to talk about how unpleasant that is for people sometimes. People don't like being disrupted. When we brought Dave Anthony, the Call of Duty game director, that caused a lot of ripples, because it was a very disruptive move for a think tank to bring in an artist like that onto the staff. But it was important. It was important not because Dave has a particular or specific vision of the future, but voices like Dave's are outside the conversation usually. They're not being let in. They have incredible ambition, though, to participate. And you'll find this among particularly successful artists, too, that they have a desire to give something back. They have a desire to be of service, to take their work and make it meaningful, especially if it's been commercially successful. So part of the project, in terms of its utility, has been trying to find ways to bring artists closer into that circle. We know that in the design process exercises we've been doing, visual arts, for example, can play a really big role in coming up with alternative ways to consider approaches to problems that are enduring and grinding and really hard to break. The way that those artists can be engaged depends on the individual, but also depends on the outcome you want. Our goal is to have artists play a meaningful role in strategic design, in foresight, and even operational concepts, in red teaming. These are the sorts of activities that draw upon the things that they do really well. And what do artists do really well? Well, when you bring them inside the circle, when you integrate them, as my very crude but hopefully effective slide is showing, they can really energize a conversation. They can say the things that nobody else wants to say. And you know why that is? It's because that's what artists are supposed to do, especially good ones. They are supposed to push the boundaries. They like to be told, no, you can't do that. Telling an artist that doesn't make any sense is often, especially somebody like Dave Anthony, we found this with Ghost Fleet, really pushing back on the assumptions and consensus to find out where the real truth might be. Fiction is a really effective way to get at these greater truths. This has been something that's been known for a long time, and I think it's increasingly important in this day and age when there are big dynamic problems that are fast-moving, that conventional approaches in the policy world and the defense world are having trouble keeping up with. It's interesting to sit around the table with a senior military officer and try to make the case that an artist can play a role in their strategic planning. There's a lot of skepticism, even if there's an initial openness to the idea. And so I think you have to be very applied about that. One of the pushbacks that we've gotten so far that's been interesting is that artists don't really need to get it right. Now, this is an image from the next Call of Duty game that comes out, I think, in about a week. Do you guys play video games here? 3 hands? 4? 5? Come on, guys, be real. It's funny, we gave a brief to some naval attaches, U.S. naval attaches at the Atlantic Council who are about to go to Europe. And I asked this question: do you guys play video games? One brave officer raised his hand. And then afterwards, 3 of them came up to me. I just couldn't say it in public. So I appreciate your candor and your honesty, but it's an important medium too, just like the short stories that we can consume, just like the visual art that we're seeing. Video games allow us to experience worlds, to start over, to work cooperatively in ways that are very difficult to do in other mediums. You're freed from a lot of the constraints because of the simple act of operating in a virtual world. And those worlds are rendered as faithfully as possible. There is nobody more concerned with that than a video game director who is trying to shoot for $1 billion in sales. Now, those aren't life or death stakes, I realize that. I'm not trying to equate them with any of the more kind of complex military problems. But they are real stakes nonetheless. There are hundreds and hundreds of people engaged in those organizations in just the act of foresight, often more than our own Defense Department might have. This was the case with Call of Duty Black Ops 2. This credibility is really important. It helps with red teaming, with kind of speaking the truth to the assumptions that we often rely on to justify status quo. Ghost Fleet was very much driven by this idea. It's one of the reasons why we footnoted it so heavily, so that people would see that the technology that we were using in new ways or in different ways, or we're drawing forward into our future, which we left undefined in the book, was real. So there's 400 endnotes to kind of backstop that ambition. The idea of red teaming is something that is, I think, becoming increasingly popular and increasingly effective as we use new tools to do so. I think some of the process that we engage in right now, even with multicolored sticky notes, the roses, buds, and thorns method, that I use around the table with my kids talking about their day at school, but clearly is important in a more elevated context too, is really, really, it's essential to the creative process and something that is ongoing, and another reason why artists and the way they work has utility. The ability to reach broader audiences, as we found with Ghost Fleet, is really important. How do you get people to talk about a conflict with China in a way that's accessible? If you write a 80-page white paper, there's no book signing for that. People aren't going to read that on the airplane. They're not going to stay up way later than they should. In fact, they'll probably be put to sleep, which is something that every author fears. And so I think that when we think about these attributes, and we see a lot of these attributes in our own ways we approach work, even if we've never played with a Wacom pad to do design, whether we've never written a short story, we also are very competitive in what we do. We want to essentially push ourselves, push our peers to be better, and to do so in a way that goes towards a greater good. That resolute spirit, that ability to kind of persevere in the face of obstacles is really, really important to recognize in the artists that you encounter if you do decide to kind of bring them into your organizations. They don't need to be talked down on, even if they are contrarian, because in fact they are quite informed, but they may be literally using a different part of their brain to approach a problem. I talked about this with Steve Grundman, my boss. He thinks about things just differently than I do sometimes. He has a more analytic point of view. What I mean by that is let's think about a future strategy, for example, that would be developed towards ISIS. The way I might go about thinking about what is our end goal. That end goal to me starts in a very visual way, thinking about who lives in that world in 2025 in whatever Syria might be. What is their pattern of life? Does a woman wear a hijab? Are there cars on the streets or not? Is there gunfire? Was there a bomb in the market yesterday? By building that world, by using design principles that are, again, inherent to the creative process, I think as an additive, we can really improve the way we think and design strategies for the future. It allows us to think about possibilities that we may not otherwise be able to encounter, like Americans as insurgents. There's a piece of Chinese propaganda from Ghost Fleet from an occupied Hawaii that insurgents, North Shore Mujahideen, have defaced. In fact, that was a poster a neighbor and I made. My brother painted it. But the point being that it allows you to have a conversation, though, about the rules of war in a future context, about what Americans will do and won't do in wartime, in a very different way than a conventional conversation about law and norms and just war ethic might. The importance, too, of thinking about how the people we bring in perceive the value of their work is also really important. Anytime you bring in outsiders. If I can give you the two takeaways, one would be to think and design visually in constructing worlds that you're trying to build a strategy towards where you want to be. The other would be to invite some people who don't belong. I feel like I belong here on the stage, thankfully, and I would encourage, as you go back to the work that you're doing in the next few weeks, to think about, they don't have to be artists even, about bringing in people to the table that can give you perspectives that are new, that are unwelcome, that challenge the assumptions that you have, that maybe invalidate your budget. Those are the kinds of points of view I think that should be increasingly important, because if we don't integrate that, well, our adversaries already are. If you think about some of the strategies that are being employed in the Pacific, they're not necessarily designed to do mirror imaging in terms of weapons development on the part of the PLA to match our order of battle one for one. Rather, it's to target the things we do best. Now, an artist will look at that problem and think, if I'm in the PLA or whatever the Chinese military becomes in the next couple of decades, what do I see the Americans most wanting to come true? That their stealthy fighters will work, that they'll be able to communicate with each other, that the stealth coding will still be operating after a few days of intense action, that their submarines will be hidden, that their comms will work and they'll be able to look over the horizon electronically. So how do I take all that away and build a world backwards from that? So not looking at it from a technology perspective first or a policy perspective first, but rather starting by constructing that world and working backward from there. We found that in some of the conversations we've had with our community of artists, which is growing, that there is a real interest in doing just that. We've, through the contests we've been running, this is, by the way, I want to give a shout out to Chris Martin. This is a series called Engines of Extinction. You should read it. It is a very creative way to think about conflict with China involving nano weapons. Chris Martin's on Twitter at ChrisMartinSBK, in case you want to follow him. But this is a bit of art that he did for our Atlantic Council Art of Future Warfare project, discussing this clandestine, super secret unit that carries out some of the most imaginative and scary missions that you could consider. Isn't that nice? I wanted to see if you were still awake. This is the alternative, right? I mean, this is an exaggeration, but how often does can the day-to-day way we communicate complex ideas look like that? This is found, I think it's a DAU slide from Wired. They had it. But the point being that, complexity imposes great costs. We do it to ourselves, and it doesn't have to be that way. And there's no better example than that one right there. I'm going to get it off the screen. So the takeaways I've given you again: build characters, invite people who don't belong, and I want to kind of move to a quote from General Dempsey, which says, "As much as we may want sci-fi to be predictive about what awaits us, or perhaps even prescriptive on how we should deal with impending challenges, the true gift of the genre lies in its ability to be provocative and its power to develop the professional imagination." Couldn't have written it better myself. And what's really great about that quote is that is going to appear in the foreword of a volume of short stories the Atlantic Council is publishing next week. I think that's a first for a think tank, a science fiction short story collection. We commissioned writers like Ken Liu, Madeline Ashby, Matt Burrows, Jamie Metzl to weigh in on everything from privateers and cyber war to what is war like in the world's most connected city as told by the two people who may be the least connected of all in that conflict, street vendors. When you take biological and gene enhancement to its logical extension in warfare, what that does to targeting, how do you prosecute a war? And what is the human cost on the people who carry that out? That's where Jamie Metzl's come in to write about. Matt Burrows, who used to run the National Intelligence Council's Future Trends reports, has of course tackled foresight. And we have some other great work by David Brin and Linda Nagata that's reprinted, and our contest winners too. We want to celebrate the people who contributed their hard work, that took the time to write to the project. When they've weighed in on everything from how a war with Russia might start, how a president would respond to a massive cyber attack. What would they tell the nation on a second day of infamy? Those are the kinds of content you'll be able to find in that collection, which I encourage you to read. It'll be published on iBooks and Amazon. It will be free to encourage as broad a distribution as possible. So I'll ask you to help spread the word about that when that goes live next week. Now, our hope in this next year, as we take the project forward, is to prove the utility, to find people to work with, to engage with, artists that can find places at your tables. And so that's part of the conversation, the overture I want to make to all of you, whether you're working in the Bay Area, whether you're working in Northern Virginia, whether you're working in the Pentagon itself, or at bases all over the country, if not the world, that we would love to get involved. We'd love to offer some of the experts we have, people like Dave Anthony, some of the artists who've contributed this visual art here. We have another fellow coming on very soon who I think will make a big splash as well, and has a strong, abiding desire to make a difference and use his storytelling to do so. And so with that, I will wrap up, and I will take your questions, and we'll hopefully keep the conversation going after this speech is done. Thank you. So I think I'm going to call on you. Keep your questions to like an actual question, and I'll repeat your question. So that's something we learned in think tank land. You have to say that. I'll repeat your question so we can get it on the mic, and we'll go from there. Please.
What's next? What's your next book?
That's a great question. Pete Singer and I, who wrote Ghost Fleet, want to work again. We're playing with a few things. I'm really curious about the future of land warfare. I think one of the interesting conversations about Ghost Fleet has been with Army officers and enlisted, trying to understand how a book focused on the Pacific articulates the future of ground operations. The thing about that question is really interesting because the book has a lot of land warfare in it. It has insurgents, it has counterinsurgency, it has amphibious invasions. The thing is, they're not carried out by US forces, they're carried out by Chinese forces. So it takes that whole conception and turns it around. So the conversation is happening, it's just not happening in the way we want. But I'm very curious about the future of the way America will prosecute land warfare, particularly thinking about man-machine interface, swarming tactics with machine on the ground, and also the kind of question of our alliances that we think will endure and hold dear. Are we sure that they will do so in an era when our allegiances are shifting economically at a global level, and our strategic priorities aren't necessarily aligned with the political commitments of populations in Europe, for example. So that's kind of where we're going. And to be honest, this book has been a year in the making. This is the cover of our short story collection. It's based off of a short story that was won by a then 19-year-old named Alec Medden, who was a sophomore at Chapman University and wrote a story that was so good that David Brin, one of the judges, selected it above some of the more experienced writers. And we brought Alec, by the way, to DC. We put him on stage alongside some very esteemed science fiction editors and David Brin. Held himself wonderfully. He's a great writer. We've hopefully given him a nudge. But that's the kind of thing the project can do, to get people who never would be heard in Washington but have something very important to say about remote operations, about space conflict and combat technologies that we don't talk about in a daily sense. And suddenly you can read his story and start that conversation. You know, Alec's one vision isn't the future, but it at least allows us to start.
What was your favorite period of military propaganda?
I think the First World War has a lot of really interesting propaganda. But I have to say the work we did trying to imagine propaganda from a future war, especially analog propaganda, and why we would use analog propaganda in the first place, was really a good exercise. And then, more importantly, reaching out to artists who don't have connection with the military. We were able to do this with a guy out of Brooklyn, Bill McMullen, who has done Beastie Boys album covers, you know, and he did a series of posters for us that are as good as you can possibly imagine. We had other artists we were working with who, like the cover that we just saw from the anthology, that's by a Greek concept design artist who I had seen his work on the internet, liked it, emailed him, and we profiled some of his work earlier in the year, and so we commissioned him to do the cover, but he did that work, and he did that for free. You know, not the cover, we commissioned him for that, but the propaganda work was done for free, which says a lot about the willingness of artists to commit their time. Especially graphic designers who are very busy and very well compensated. So stealing their attention away from their day job is a big deal. And it's something we actually really have to do better a job at, I think, in our community. Yes?
You have folks that look at the relevancy of the Geneva Convention 20, 30, 40 years from now. Does that adapt based on the work by how we prosecute about rules of engagement?
So have we taken a look at the future of kind of black letter law and conflict, the Geneva Convention, that sort of thing? We haven't, but that would be a great contest. It would be great to have not only short stories on something like that, but visual arts. You know, we tried to engage the kind of graphic novel artist community because they have a really interesting way of doing storytelling. You know, using storyboards, for example, to start, and working with writers and illustrators in close concert, very team-driven way. You know, this is something I think, again, to my point about why artists and the way they work matters. Their collaborative ability among the most successful is as good as you'll see. You know, the kind of stereotypical image of a I don't know, a writer, you know, banging away on a laptop in a cold cabin somewhere by themselves. A few people can do that, but that's really not actually the way the best work gets done. You know, it's a very integrated process. There are writers groups that coach and coax. There are co-writers, in my case, that allowed us to write a book that I think is far better than either of us could have done on our own. We did a lot faster, importantly. The editors you work with are very much aligned in getting your book as good as possible because they want it to sell. Publishing is a commercial business, let's not forget. So there are a lot of incentives to make things as marketable as possible, too. So that kind of collaborative approach is really significant. But again, to your point, that would be a great contest, and we should maybe talk about that.
Take one more.
What technology from Ghost Fleet scares me the most? I think the scariest thing, I'll answer that two ways. The scariest thing is technology denial to me. You know, to be able to make people go dark, to be able to make a destroyer captain be forced to look through binoculars to understand what's happening, to get situational awareness. One of the most interesting technologies, and I say this as someone who wrote in the book that the Tour de France was canceled because of using essentially a nanobot that moved red blood cells carried oxygen more efficiently in your body. In the book, we have Navy SEALs using that, which allows them to swim for, you know, they're called respirocytes, swim for hours without breaking surface. That is a really interesting technology. When you get into that ability to modify the body to perform better, you know, under the mission objective that is very clear, and it goes in a very disruptive way against, you know, decades of the way we, for example, operate underwater with tanks and such like that. So, and then I'll give you Pete's scariest technology because it's really scary, and I would do a reading for it if we had more time. But there are technologies that allow like brain-stem interface with machines. And that's something that's being used for physical therapy. It's being used to treat PTSD even. But we figured out that you could also use it to manipulate memory to interrogate and torture people. And so we did that in the book. That was pretty scary. Thank you guys for paying attention, staying awake, and please feel free to follow up afterwards.